Book 101 review. Book 101 is all about the books that are around for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. She is a UK and US political commentator, founder and CEO of the Wayfinders Group, no other than Miss Leah Brown. Welcome to Book 101, Miss Leah. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. My name is Leah, yes, and I rebuild trust when things get political and when egos get out of control. I work as a lawyer and as a mediator, and I spend a lot of time helping people rebuild relationships.
Awesome. And Miss Leah Brown, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And today, let's talk about rebuilding trust in Britain's publicly funded institutions. What inspired you to explore the theme of rebuilding trust in Britain's public institution and why this is conversation urgent now?
Yeah, great question. In October, I went to Johannesburg in South Africa to do a restorative justice initiative. And I saw the ways in which the communities in the townships were struggling to achieve justice. I saw the ways in which they didn't trust the courts and they didn't trust the lawyers. And the vigilante justice was really concerning to me because it's where people go when they don't feel like they are listened to. And I got back to the UK and I was thinking about how can I write up the impact of this trip? How can I write up all the ways in which people feel disengaged with politics and disengaged with the institutions that are supposed to protect them, that they pay their taxes to support? And I was alerted to this wonderful book called Truth and Repair by Judith L. Herman, which examines the criminal justice system in the United States. And it is a fantastic book about survivor led justice. And I was so inspired by it that I used it as the base of the framework for what it would take to rebuild trust in Britain. Now, it's a slightly different context, but for those who know anything about Britain's politics, we've had a huge number of prime ministers in recent years. We've had a huge amount of economic upheaval, and we've had a huge amount of change, and yet the public are still not happy. And so, this idea of repair is really central to the future of our society, change, and obviously economic growth.
How do you find harm in the context of publicly funded institutions?
Yeah, so that could be a relationship between the police and somebody that they have arrested, or perhaps where they have wrongfully arrested someone. We have stop and search powers that are quite controversial in the UK. It could be a doctor on a maternity ward who has not performed their role correctly, and so a baby has died. It could be a situation where an organization like the post office, where they have wrongly removed somebody from their role and stolen their livelihood and have to pay compensation to them, or the Windrush compensation scheme, where people who would come over on the Windrush, part of that generation who had been denied their right to remain in the UK. And again, a compensation scheme was set up to support them. And the administration of that has broken down trust between the state and the people that it exists to serve. So harm is an express and an implied construct. It could be criminal, it could be civil. But it's any situation where an organization has done wrong by the people it is supposed to serve.
Very well said, Miss Leah. Beautifully articulated. Can you share an example of a historical or recent institutional failure that particularly shaped your perspective?
Yeah, a few years ago, I think 8 years now, you might have heard that there was a tower block in North Kensington in London, and it had been fitted with external materials that were flammable. We call it cladding in the UK. Many of the other high-rise houses had also been fitted with a similar material, but the renovations to the property, which would have been slightly more expensive but would have saved lives, were not implemented. And so when a fire was caused in one of the lower flats, the entire building was enveloped in flames. People were instructed by the fire brigade to remain in their accommodation, and subsequently 72 people lost their lives. That is an example of an institutional failure where the government had a legal obligation to do right by its citizens for whom it had a duty of care, and it breached that duty of care on multiple levels, both prior to the incident and surrounding the incident. And there are many people who have been part of that experience who are still waiting for justice. They are waiting for an apology, they are waiting for compensation, and they are waiting to ensure that something like this can never happen again.
Waiting for justice indeed. What are the root causes of declining public trust in the institutions like the NHS, local councils, or the justice system?
I honestly think that we have a cultural problem with accountability. So if somebody does something that is wrong, they don't want to accept that they've done something wrong. They don't want to confirm to the person who has been wronged that they are responsible for the wrong that has happened, and they don't want to do anything to make amends for that wrong. They certainly won't apologize for it culturally. And so, the number one challenge I think that causes a breakdown in trust is that unwillingness to take accountability for what has happened.
Definitely. Accountability, people. Accountability indeed. What do efforts to reform institutions often fail, and would you genuine accountability look like?
Well, often the way that people try to reform organizations is by chopping the head off, right? They throw the baby out with the bathwater, all those kind of idioms. But if it's a cultural problem, if you're not changing the way that the leaders who are responsible for running the organization think, you're just going to bring in leaders who thought the same way as the old leaders. Um, I think it's a focus on relationship rather than a focus on hierarchy. I think we are very disconnected when we're talking about the state. You know, it's this kind of body, but it's not human. It doesn't have life to it. But actually, the state is comprised of institutions that are run by people. And so when we look at an institution through the lens of the people who are responsible for it, it suddenly becomes possible to attribute accountability and then get them to make decisions that are either right or wrong, that either improve or worsen a situation. And so, if we really want to rebuild trust, we will create a forum where we are able to hold the leaders accountable for the decisions they make on behalf of the state, praise them when they are right, and sanction them or censure them when they are wrong. And there is no legal obligation for those leaders to take accountability at present.
Can you highlight an institution that has successfully rebuilt trust after a crisis? What strategies work, Miss Leia?
So, for example, the closest is probably for 20 years in the National Health Service, we had what we call the infected blood scandal, where infected blood resulted in people having diagnoses of hepatitis and AIDS, and they were wrongly given contaminated blood. But great steps were taken to be able to take ownership. The government took ownership of that issue. And part of that not only accepted that the failure should have never happened, but it identified what the failure was and then it apologized for it. What has not yet happened is to make amends for it, to create structures that don't permit those kinds of failures to happen again. And so I think what I would submit to you is that no institution has really truly adopted a restorative approach in the UK because it is always left wanting to some degree. So if the framework for what is necessary is accountability and apology and acknowledgement and amends, the amends bit usually gets left off. So I would say, to answer your question, I'm not sure there is a perfect example.
What lessons can Britain learn from other countries that have addressed similar institutional distrust?
So I think a good example here is South Africa. And that's because post apartheid, there's been such a huge focus on truth and reconciliation. But culturally, Britain has a problem with truth. I think South Africa has a problem with truth. In fact, I think every society struggles to stare at itself back in the mirror. I think that is human nature. I think we feel uncomfortable about things that have transpired in the past. And I think we like to think that if it was us living in history, we wouldn't make the same decisions. But history has shown that we would. And I think that these other societies, whether that's Northern Ireland, whether that's South Africa, any nation that has really been ripped, the fabric has been torn, and they've had to figure out how do we bring very different people together again, has had to grapple with a shared narrative of what is true. And that really is the starting point for any kind of reconciliation. Where is the common ground? What can we agree? And where would we collectively like to move from here?
Miss Leah, how do scandals like Grenfell, False Office Horizon, or Windrush reflect systemic flaws in oversight and redress?
Well, I don't know about you, but if somebody, I don't know, let's say you went to the supermarket and let's say you were in the frozen aisle. And let's say the frozen canisters had melted and there was water all over the floor and you fell and you broke your neck. I don't think you would want the supermarket to be responsible for deciding how much money they should pay you. What is happening in the way that the redress for these awful scandals are happening is that the same person who has caused the harm is responsible for deciding who gets the money and how much money they get. There is no independence. There is no independent oversight. There is no person checking the checker. It is just arbitrary, and it's problematic. And so, for example, if you're somebody who has suffered harm and you are not eligible for legal advice or you cannot afford your own legal advice, the outcome that you get is going to be so materially worse that it represents in and of itself an injustice as great as the harm you have already suffered. And that is the way that the government responds to scandals in the United Kingdom. We call it the tortfeasor as compensator problem, because the same person who caused the harm is responsible for the compensation. And that doesn't really work because there's no adult in the room to say, this is how we're going to police this, and this is how we're going to make sure this is fair, and this is how we're going to make sure that we're not making the harm worse.
Ms. Leah, as a UK and US political commentator, founder and CEO of the Wine Finders Group, what are your short term and long term goals?
What are my short term and long term goals?
Yes.
Short term, I would like to see a national restorative framework. We have what we call the Nolan principles for civic life that we expect politicians and civil services to abide by. I don't think people really understand what they mean, and I don't think that they understand how they sit alongside leadership culturally. And so I would like to see those improved to include some of these restorative principles so that we can work on relationships because that is as important as the decisions that are being made. Longer term, I would like to see an office, an independent office for institutional accountability. I would like us to be able to say that in a world where we have one of the best justice systems in the world, where we have a fantastic historical parliamentary system, that we can look in the mirror with good conscience and say confidently that we did the right thing because we had an adult in the room helping good decisions be made. And I'm going to be working with my team and in collaboration with a lot of other organizations to be moving forwards on this whole accountability for the government and what that would look like in the future.
Good luck to your goals, Miss Leah, and looking forward for more success. What will be your piece of advice for those people out there who want to be a commentator as well as a founder and CEO?
You've got to do what makes your heart sing. You have to find a way to incorporate some of your passions in your ordinary life. People can tell whether you are showing up in a situation authentically. People can tell whether or not you're passionate about what it is that you are talking about. It's a huge privilege to me to be able to be so engaged in the news and politics, both sides of the pond, but also to be able to bring that into my practice and constantly be refining my skills, whether that's on a podcast or on TikTok or on a stage or behind the microphone myself or in written form. I think you have to play to your strengths. And I think as long as you play to your strengths and as long as you combine that with passion and ambition, you are able to do whatever you set your mind to.
Very well said, and thank you for that advice, Miss Leah. Very well said. And can you please recommend a book that influenced your journey or books that influence your journey?
Well, as I mentioned, I think this book professionally, Truth and Repair, it has been really critical to my professional work. But personally, I just love Educated. It is one of the best memoirs I have ever read, and it has been really monumental in my own memoir writing journey. And I really think Tara Westover is just such a phenomenal writer and a brave woman, and I attribute my finding my voice to reading her book.
Well, thank you for that recommendation, Miss Leah. And beyond policy changes, what cultural shifts are needed within institutions to prioritize healing over bureaucracy?
I think we need to count the cost, right? From a behavioral science perspective, people don't invest in the root of the problem because it seems more expensive and it doesn't seem as urgent. But actually, I think data shows if you don't address things when they're going culturally awry soon enough, you will end up so far off course you won't be able to bring it back. I think we need to start seeing people's experiences and taking them at face value. I think if somebody expresses that they have been harmed in some way, we need to be curious about that. And we need to be curious about the ways that we can not only support them, but make amends for what it is that they've been through.
Definitely. What role do apologies, reparations, or truth-telling process play in rebuilding trust?
One of the biggest ways in which a survivor is harmed is by the denial of their experience. And so truth telling is critical. We talked about the shared narrative earlier, but I think it's more than that. I think we cannot erase people's experiences, their lived experiences, because uh, to separate someone from their lived experiences is to express something that takes away from the truth of that experience. If somebody wants to move on, and you often hear from a survivor, what they want in justice is to ensure that what happened to them will not happen to anyone else. How can you achieve that justice unless you have told the truth about what has happened?
Miss Leia, if you could implement one radical change tomorrow to restore trust, what would it be?
I think I would probably introduce legislation to make truth telling compulsory. There would be a legal duty for politicians to tell the truth.
But nothing but the truth. Can grassroots movements pressure institutions to change?
Yes, absolutely, without hesitation, and they do. We see that the whistleblowers have a huge following. The Hillsborough families who struggled for 34 years to get justice That has been a grassroots effort. Grenfell, Justice for Grenfell, Justice for Windrush, these are all grassroots initiatives that have put huge amounts of pressure campaigning and lobbying the government to bring about change and justice.
Certainly. And how can communities actively participate in holding institutions accountable rather than feeling powerless?
Yes. So I think, first of all, survivors need to be empowered to speak up and they need to find communities where they feel safe to do so. Second of all, constituents need to write to their MPs and they need to demand this change. They need to say, when things are not acceptable or when justice has not been achieved. There are huge opportunities for people to get involved on these disparate issues. But also, there are a lot of umbrella organizations that are working to support survivors and to advocate politically for change.
Ms. Leah, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too, comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well, geography 101 in fourth season, and my baby podcast, Law 101, and mental health 101, love letters in its third season, and my movie 101 review and music 101 in fourth season, and science 101 and sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcasts. And Miss Leah, what gives you hope that Britain's public institutions can resolve or can evolve from harm to healing?
These things are cyclical. And it's a question of timing. But I think the time is ripe for disruption. When things aren't working, people always look for solutions. And ultimately, relationships being rebuilt hold the solution here. I think we have an opportunity to move in a different direction as a society and to draw a line under the past and move forwards. And I hope that that's something that the government wants to take the opportunity to do, because we've had enough scandals and we've had enough people failing to take responsibility. What would life be like if we could flip the script on that and actually have a time of collective healing?
Miss Leah Brown, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your advocacy, your projects, or anything that you're doing right now?
Yes, of course. Well, please do follow the Longest Day podcast, which I am the host of. And please do follow me on all social media platforms. I can be found at Leah Talks _.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Leah Brown, because if you support her, for sure, more and more empowering episodes of the podcast, more and more empowering advocacy, and more empowering commentating for everyone. So, Miss Leah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. It's been great to be here.
More to come, people. See you soon.